Greetings, everyone. Missiles are ready to strike the Kremlin. Putin is furious and issues an ultimatum to destroy Kyiv. Ladies and gentlemen, Russia is holding its breath as it enters a sacred historical milestone, but it is overshadowed by an unprecedented gloomy atmosphere in 2026. The Kremlin is not only dealing with external pressure, but also facing a seismic shock from deep within the regime. The harsh reality of war has broken through media cover-ups, coming from TV screens and hitting the Russian people's consciousness. The deadly shadows of drones are lurking, ready to cover Red Square, directly threatening the last pride of Russia's leader on Victory Day. The harsh truth is that Russia is no longer an impregnable fortress. This very morning, the sky over the Naro-Fominsk area was torn apart by a swarm of Ukrainian drones. Like a swarm of crazed hornets bursting from their nest, they charged straight into the massive 200-hectare military logistics complex located entirely within Military District No. 3, forcing the local air defense system to desperately intercept them, to the astonishment of onlookers. To cling to the glory of the past and maintain the illusion of victory, the authorities seem willing to pay any price. Despite the massive budget deficit of the economy, 1 billion rubles was spent on activities commemorating May 9th. As for St. Petersburg, it broke its own record by burning up to 300 million rubles for this display. However, behind those huge numbers is a stark truth that is being hidden due to security concerns. Military parades have been completely canceled in at least 15 regions. And for the first time in modern history, both the capital Moscow and St. Petersburg are completely absent of heavy armored war machines on the streets. Aware of the fragility of this celebration, the Kremlin sent Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova in front of the cameras to deliver a bloody ultimatum. The threat was issued coldly. If the president's parade plans is disrupted, a fierce retaliatory strike will target decision-making centers in Kyiv. An unprecedented urgent diplomatic note was sent to all diplomatic missions and international organizations, urging them to immediately evacuate all staff and citizens from Kyiv. This document clearly states that if the Ukrainian authorities dare to carry out plans considered terrorist acts against Moscow on this sacred holiday, the Russian armed forces will certainly launch a decisive and brutal retaliatory strike directly at key infrastructure in Kyiv, regardless of the possibility of killing countless Ukrainian civilians or unintentionally taking the lives of foreigners. Kyiv authorities were not shaken at all, facing fury from Moscow. From the Bankova Power Center, Volodymyr Zelenskyy made a forceful statement. He frankly exposed the hypocrisy of the other side when Russia completely ignored all ceasefire proposals for diplomatic purposes, continuing to rain bombs down on a series of Ukrainian cities both before and after midnight on May 6th. With a firm stance, he declared that the next 24 hours would be a decisive period to see whether Ukraine's weapons would actually reach Red Square or not. The warning from the Ukrainian president carried tremendous weight, emphasizing that if the man in Moscow, who cannot exist without war and is obsessed with a single parade, continues to ignore peace efforts, then Ukraine will certainly launch completely fair and justified retaliatory strikes. The battlefield stalemate is seriously threatening the regime's survival in Moscow. The Russian people's trust in the elite is collapsing and plummeting to rock bottom, especially as the parliamentary elections and autumn are approaching very soon. The deep and precise attacks by the Ukrainian army have completely shattered the voters' traditional loyalty. Polling organizations from state-affiliated agencies like the All-Russian Public Opinion Research Center, the Public Opinion Foundation FOM, to the independent Levada Center, all have to acknowledge a horrifying truth. The president's approval rating has plummeted for 9 consecutive weeks, dropping from a peak of 71% in 2015 to a record low of just 29% now. In just 1 year, this rate has fallen by 12.2 points and dropped another 7.9 points since the beginning of March. This is the most devastating collapse since the pension reform in 2018. Even the bloody military mobilization in 2022 did not cause such a severe shock. What is even more frightening are the undercurrents surging within the Kremlin. Why were these disastrous figures allowed to be published so widely? Analysts point out that a fierce covert civil war is taking place between the Russian Federal Security Service, especially Department 2 in charge of politics, and the presidential office led by Kirilenko. The ruling elite understands that the initial goals have now become hopeless, and they are tearing each other apart to find a way out, but no one dares to openly admit it. Amidst that chaos, the intelligence network has identified a traitor right inside the Kremlin, someone who is secretly planning to assassinate the dictator and seize power. At the same time, Patriarch Kirill, whose secular name is Vladimir Gander, as the spiritual leader of Russia, is holding prayer sessions for a Russia without the current president. In another development, with the government's apparatus falling apart, desperate Russian citizens are pushing and attacking European Union visa centers in search of a way to escape, while a massive espionage scandal involving Russian diplomats in Austria has just been exposed, revealing how they concealed their identities to eavesdrop on Western targets. The glamour is gradually fading away, giving way to a tragic and fierce geopolitical picture. In the shadows of power at the Kremlin, the Federal Protection Service, FS, not only guards the leader's life, but is also desperately trying to hide a shocking truth: the collapse of a legend. Secret sociological surveys, which serve as a unique gauge of public sentiment for the elite, are painting a grim picture as support for Putin has plummeted below 65.5% by the end of April, and in reality, it could be even worse. In a society where every careless word can be considered slandering the military, silence is not agreement, but rather absolute fear. Ordinary Russian citizens, when faced with investigators from VTCOM or the security forces, often instinctively put on a mask of loyalty as a means of survival. They cheer, they give military salutes simply because they don't understand what sociology is. They only know that refusing to trust the president means putting themselves on the blacklist. Because of this alarming decline, for the first time in history, VTCOM decided not to publish the weekly approval ratings right before the parade. Even last year, this figure was proudly displayed at over 78%. Anxiety is spreading like a virus with no cure. For the first time since the incident in the Kust region in 2024, the public's anxiety chart has far surpassed the calmness index in the public rankings of the FOM organization. The alarm sirens aren't sounding, and a state of emergency hasn't been declared, but the Russian people can feel the heat of war right at their doorstep. They feel suffocated when the internet is restricted and Telegram is blocked, removing their last way to communicate. In hidden corners, people whisper to each other about their fear of police cars waiting to arrest them, taking them to dark places if they dare to speak out in protest. But it's not just the repression, it's the economic stagnation and the specter of inflation that truly undermine public confidence. Prices have soared to unimaginable levels, making people realize that the promises of stability were just illusions. The military euphoria that once helped people forget this pain has worn off. They once believed that hardship was only temporary and that Russia was eternal, but now hardship seems permanent, while the existence of Putin's empire has become more fragile than ever. That pain also reaches the occupied territories, where those who once rejoiced and welcomed those little green Russian troops are now tasting the bitter fruit of betrayal. The promises of a Soviet-style paradise with cheap utilities and free healthcare in 2022 have vanished into thin air. Now they have to pay 3 times as much for everything and face constant penalties. It turns out that all they got was a credit trap full of pitfalls, and now it's time for the Kremlin to collect its debt for a year of living in a dream. The feeling of being deceived mixes with fear as Ukrainian drones strike deep into the interior, thousands of kilometers away, proving that Putin can no longer protect anyone. On the battlefield, reality is not as rosy as what the federal television channels fabricate. In April alone, Russia lost another 116 square kilometers of territory, and it is the Ukrainian army that now holds the initiative in the offensive. The cracks within the regime are no longer just idle rumors, but have been concretely documented in intelligence reports from the European Union in early 2026. The Kremlin is shaken by rumors, sensitive information, and the risk of a palace coup. The greatest fear now is not missiles from the enemy, but drones controlled by Russia's own political elite, those who, just yesterday, were pillars of the power structure. When the addiction to power, a substance more devastating than any drug, begins to be threatened, the beast cornered will also become extremely vigilant. The Federal Protective Service, FSO, has made the leader's movements a special operation, raising the level of meticulous control. From the modern bunkers in the Krasnodar region, where the leader can stay for weeks at a time, Russian media can only use pre-recorded footage to deceive the public about a presence that isn't real. The control mechanism has now become more extreme than ever before. All visitors must undergo 2 thorough inspections, and the list of places where the leader is allowed to appear has been reduced to an absolute minimum. Military inspections or the residences that once symbolized power are now things of the past. In Moscow, communication networks are periodically disrupted, and the FSO military, along with police units, patrol intensively along the banks of the Moscow River to prevent any threats from the air. Even the closest associates have been stripped of the right to use smartphones with internet access, instead being given basic devices and having a surveillance system installed right in their homes. In that context, the name Sergei Shoigu, former Minister of Defense and now Secretary of the Security Council, has emerged as a leading destabilizing factor. Western intelligence agencies have begun to view Shoigu as a potential threat, someone who could become a direct danger to the very system he once helped build. The collapse of trust became even more serious after the arrest of Zhezlan Salikov and the mysterious death of Lieutenant General Afanasy Sabarov. Russian security agencies stopped acting as a unified bloc and started blaming each other. Chief of General Staff Gerasimov accused the intelligence agencies of incompetence, while the Federal Security Service, FSB, and the National Guard shifted the responsibility for protecting military facilities. This chaos forced the leader to personally intervene and expand the authority of Dmitry Kornev, the head of the FSO, turning this agency into a super department overseeing not only external threats, but also the internal workings of the government. The clearest evidence of this division is that, for the first time, no representative from any allied nation received an invitation to attend the May 9th parade. A system that has always operated on fear began to tear itself apart when every member of the hierarchy realized that they could be the next target. While the elite are tearing each other apart, the Russian people are also carrying out a silent but determined exodus. According to data from the Schengen Barometer of the European Commission, last year saw a record number of 670,000 visa applications from Russian citizens, of which more than 620,000 were approved. The increase has occurred across all aspects, from tourist visas to trips to visit relatives in the very countries that Russian media have labeled as enemies. Those who once called themselves patriots are now doing everything they can to set foot in the land of their adversaries, seeking a way out as the promises of a strong Russia gradually fall apart. The truth about a regime that is weakening from within can no longer be hidden behind the stone walls of the Kremlin or the prayers in churches. It is now clearly evident in every statistic, every scheme, and every wave of people leaving the country. In a contradictory turn in the European geopolitical landscape, the latest statistics on Schengen visas reveal a deeply ironic reality. Despite calls for strict measures to isolate the aggressor nation, the reality presents a completely different scenario. As much as 1/3 of the visas issued to Russian citizens come from 3 countries: France, Italy, and Spain. What's notable here is the division within Europe itself, as many diplomats in Paris have tried to delay the disclosure of this data. Clearly, there is a vast gap between political statements and practical actions, where isolation exists only on paper, while people continue to flock to the luxurious destinations of the West. However, that false sense of calm is being shattered in Austria, which has long been considered a safe haven for intelligence activities for decades. Now, the authorities have decided to end the game of hide-and-seek under the cover of diplomacy by expelling a large number of Russian agents disguised as officials. A scandal erupted when it was revealed that the Russian embassy roof and buildings in Donaustadt, home to diplomatic families, were covered with numerous antennas. This specialized equipment system was designed to turn the city into a giant ear, stealing top-secret data from international organizations headquartered in the Austrian capital. 3 Russian diplomats, whose names were kept confidential, were accused of directly participating in the espionage network and expelled from Austria after Russia refused to waive their diplomatic immunity for investigation. The Kremlin's response was not unexpected, as the Russian embassy in Austria continuously issued provocative statements on social media. They called this an unfriendly move, highly political in nature, and completely lacking in concrete evidence. The Russian side also emphasized that among those expelled were members of the permanent delegation to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, who had closely monitored the ceasefire in Donbass since 2014. A warning was issued that a retaliatory countermeasure would soon be taken, and all responsibility for the breakdown of bilateral relations, which are already at their lowest point in modern history, would rest entirely with Austria. Since 2020, a total of 14 Kremlin agents have been exposed in Austria. The most notable case was the arrest of Augusto Ott in 2024, a former Austrian counterintelligence officer accused of running a spy network for Russia, transferring government security equipment to Moscow, and monitoring Putin opponents in Europe. It was this betrayal from within that forced a traditionally neutral country like Austria to change its course, shifting to a hardline policy against all espionage activities. This diplomatic storm has even spread to the media sector, where Russian journalists have come under scrutiny, causing a wave of outrage from Moscow. Russia has declared that if the policy of expelling journalists is not reconsidered, they will respond in kind by expelling Austrian reporters working in Russia. This is seen as a psychological tactic to put pressure on press freedom, but in reality, it is a last-ditch effort to protect the propaganda machine's proxies. As other European countries closed their doors to Russian agents, Austria was no longer a fully safe haven. The Austrian government is more determined to tighten laws, aiming to turn the country into a fortress against shadowy forces. The time for the Kremlin's covert activities here seems to have run out, and we will certainly witness even more shocking upheavals in the near future. So in your opinion, do these developments mark the end of Russia's image as a military superpower?